When you think of your favorite Christmas movies, what things tend to come to mind? Maybe you think of holiday specials that you watched growing up, familiar animated faces and upbeat songs and messages. Maybe you remember important truths conveyed to you by familiar celebrities and characters, reaffirming that even though life can be hard, at Christmas time, you could put that aside to enjoy the company of family and friends. One of these types of scenes I think of often is from the Santa Claus. In the scene, protagonist Scott Calvin has just had his visitation rights revoked from seeing his son Charlie. In the final stages of his Santa transformation, he takes a long walk at night. It is one of the most poignant scenes in the film, as it is quiet and contemplative. At the end of the walk, Scott arrives at the home of his former family. As he looks through the window at them having dinner, he quietly wonders if every choice he has made throughout the film has been worth it, or if he has only succeeded in pushing his family away from him. Christmas!
I wanna be Santa Claus, so I'm gonna kill Santa Claus.
The Santa Claus is a 1994 film about a shady businessman who, after committing a violent murder, slowly begins to lose his sanity to the point where he can no longer tell the difference between reality and fantasy. Oh wait, I'm sorry. I accidentally summarized American Psycho instead of this movie. You can understand my confusion. There are just so many similar themes between the two films.
Giving me coal for Christmas.
The film actually follows an underhanded toy salesman named Scott Calvin and his estranged son Charlie, bonding over Scott accidentally murdering Santa. Brought to you by the Walt Disney Company. The film did so well in the box office that 8 years later, Disney decided to make 2 more for purely artistic reasons. I mean, with lore like this, how could you not want to explore the setting further?
Hello, such a glitter company.
So, in celebration of Christmas, let's take a serious look at this trio of movies, and see if there is anything of worth in the film and its sequels, or if Jack's Films was right all along.
The Santa Claus 2, the Santa Claus 3. Both films are atrocities.
The plot of The Santa Claus is pretty simple. On Christmas Eve, Scott Calvin has to look after his son Charlie while his ex-wife Laura and her husband Neil go to have Christmas dinner with Neil's parents. Scott's attempts to bond with his son, such as having a Christmas dinner despite having no skills as a cook, fail hopelessly. But all of this changes when Scott accidentally causes the death of Santa Claus. Father and son bond over Scott taking Santa's place and wearing his outfit, and delivering Santa's gifts. However, upon returning to the North Pole with Santa's sleigh, Scott Calvin is informed by head elf Bernard that by wearing Santa's coat, he has effectively appointed himself the new Santa.
Impressive. Very nice.
The next morning, Scott dismisses the previous night's events as a dream, but over the course of the following year, Scott slowly begins to lose his identity as he transforms into Santa, in complete denial of what is happening. While Charlie believes that Scott is Santa, Laura and Neil believe that Scott is deliberately manipulating him, and as Scott's transformation escalates, they eventually revoke his visitation rights. The film crescendos when Scott accepts his calling and takes Charlie with him to the North Pole, while his parents believe that Scott has abducted him. So on Christmas Eve, the police arrest Scott, but he is eventually freed by Charlie and a squad of elf commandos. The film wraps up with Scott making amends with Charlie's family, who restore his visitation rights, and he evades the police, who have brought a SWAT team and a police sniper to deal with Santa Claus. The film ends with Charlie and Scott working together to deliver the last of the gifts, ending with my favorite way to end a Christmas film: people screaming. Santa! Considering how insane the later films get, the first film being more grounded makes it stand out a lot more. While the other films have traditional villains, the main antagonists of this film are denial and disbelief, which is pretty novel for this Disney Christmas movie. Scott's denial and disbelief of the events of the start of the film are the driving force of the plot, as his refusal to accept himself eventually causes a rift between him and his family. The antagonistic themes are also personified by Neil, the punching bag of the trilogy, whose job as a psychologist makes him the most logical person to convey them, aside from Scott.
What about the reindeer? Have you ever seen a reindeer fly?
Yes.
Well, I haven't.
Both Neil and Laura disbelieve in Santa, as they didn't receive specific gifts from him when they were kids.
Oh, come on, Laura. Don't you remember when you stopped believing in Santa Claus?
I was Charlie's age.
I was 3.
But Charlie still desperately wants to believe in Santa. Scott is shown very early on in the film to take any side in an argument in order to come out on top. So him taking Charlie's side in the argument with Laura at the start of the film casts doubt on whether or not he legitimately believes in Santa. This is also what causes the rift to grow between him and Charlie's parents.
I never thought you would stoop to changing your physical appearance in order to make Charlie like you.
The film can't outright say that Laura and Neil think that Scott is deliberately turning himself into Santa in order to manipulate Charlie into spending more time with him, since this is a PG Disney Christmas film.
Get the fuck out of my sight before I demolish you.
But it heavily implies that this is the case. This makes sense, because for a majority of the film, Scott is a sarcastic asshole, so it would be in character for him to potentially do this. He is bitter towards Neil and Laura, and incredibly dismissive of the psychologist, even though the biggest show of his bad side in this film is him working for a toy company.
Since we've opened this box, have any of you tried to build the total tank? It's got 10,000 parts, and even if you do get it together, it breaks 10 minutes later. Then you gotta spend more money just to buy new parts.
I thought that was the whole point.
His gradual transformation into Santa is shown to be a positive character change, as he quits working for that company, and eventually reconciles with Neil and Laura by not only returning Charlie and apologizing to them, but by giving them the gifts that caused them to stop believing in Santa. The way that this movie uses the Christmas mythos is also interesting. Santa Claus, in the context of this film, is less of a singular figure and more of a title that is passed on between individuals. It's weird because the new Santas only seem to be created when someone accidentally kills one in this universe, but the films don't really focus on this aspect too much. However, Bernard makes it clear that when Scott tries to back out, that Christmas is inherently tied to Santa.
See, children hold the spirit of Christmas within their hearts. You wouldn't want to be responsible for killing the spirit of Christmas, now would you? Santa?
So maybe Christmas willed Santa into existence, or children's collective belief in him eventually caused him to manifest. I know I'm probably reading too much into this movie, but why else do you watch my content? Do you think that the weight of being immortal weighs on Bernard? And maybe the reason why he's so snarky is that he has watched every Santa that he has ever befriended eventually die and be replaced? Is he willing to nip this in the bud because he knows that eventually Tim Allen will die and be replaced by another person? Anyway, the design of the North Pole, as well as Scott's Santa appearance and the new sleigh later in the movie, have aged surprisingly well, and they look the best in this movie. The film also has a surprisingly good sense of humor.
It's okay, I'm used to it. I lived through the 60s.
While later films rely on a lot of slapstick, gross-out humor, this film has a lot of witty delivery and a lot of good sarcastic jokes. The film also does a lot of groundwork at its opening to subtly lay out the themes of the movie. Not only does it show where Scott is at when the film begins, but also lays out the more magical aspects of the world, as well as the themes it will be exploring. There's even a surprising amount of good background jokes that you only really notice if you're paying attention, such as the police remembering to mark a donut shop when they plan their raid to capture Scott at Laura and Neil's house. Overall, the film is good, and if you could get behind some of the more dated aspects, like the CGI, I think that you'll have a good time with this comfort movie. Anyways, in the next movie, Santa's evil toy clone turns the North Pole into an authoritarian dictatorship. The Santa Claus 2 starts with the North Pole almost being discovered by workers searching for oil.
Anything can be bought and sold for the right oil.
8 years after the original film, Scott Calvin finds out that his free trial of Santa Claus Premium is about to run out, and unless he gets married before Christmas, he'll go back to being Tim Allen. To cover for Scott while he looks for a wife, Bernard and new character Curtis create a toy copy of Santa to replace him while he's gone. As the film progresses, things begin to spiral. Charlie is now a rebel who graffitis his high school because he disagrees with his principal Carol Newman's views on Christmas. Scott eventually falls for Newman as his remaining magic begins to drain from his attempts to impress her, and Toy Santa starts to become self-aware. Things come to a head when Principal Newman rejects Scott's advances because she thinks he's insane and trying to draw on her love of Christmas in order to get into a relationship. Charlie discovers that his dad has been hitting on his arch enemy, and Toy Santa turns the North Pole into a dictatorship. The film comes to a close with the cast coming together to stop Toy Santa from delivering coal to the children of the world, the toppling of an authoritarian government, and Scott getting married to Principal Newman. What a great ending.
Everybody loves Christmas.
To the film's credit, it expands the universe in interesting ways. To start with, this film introduces the concept of other legendary figures existing in the same universe, though it is unclear if they are titles passed between people like how Santa was in the previous film. Do you think Art LaFleur had to kill The Rock or Larry the Cable Guy in order to become the Tooth Fairy? Leave your answer in the comments below! And don't forget to like and subscribe! The plot point of Scott having to get married in order to remain Santa is incredibly contrived, but it does lead to an interesting comparison between the characters of Carol Newman and Toy Santa.
You are a sad, strange little man.
When Principal Newman is first introduced, she is presented as a cold and uncaring person who hates Christmas and doesn't believe that it should be celebrated publicly. I guess PragerU was right after all. There is a war on Christmas, and Carol Newman is leading the charge against it! As the film progresses and she begins to open up to Scott, we find out that unlike Neil and Laura, who stopped believing in Santa just because he wouldn't get them gifts, Carol stopped believing in Santa because of how she would get in fights at school with people who didn't believe in him, causing her parents to tell her the truth. This rocked her worldview to the core, eventually turning her into the outwardly cynical principal from the start of the film. But even this is a facade. Despite her outward appearance, Carol does care deeply about the students that attend the high school she runs, though she may be a little overzealous in trying to help them.
Keep away from the car, it's new. I don't need some delinquent kids scratching it up.
Hey, they're not delinquents, they're good kids, and don't worry about your car.
If I were you, I'd spend more time worrying about your legs in those shorts.
Yeah, I thought only swimmers shave their legs.
Cool it with the homophobic remarks.
Toy Santa is the complete opposite of this. Unlike Scott, who was a human before becoming Santa Claus, Toy Santa was made to be a perfect copy of him. However, there is no humanity to him at all. He just mimics what the trio of characters who created him tell him to do. What causes Toy Santa to even gain sentience of any kind is when he begins to read the Book of Santa Rules, and in response to perceiving the North Pole as coming up short, he turns it into what he perceives as a perfect society. It is implied that under Scott's leadership, the North Pole has adopted a less literal interpretation of the Santa rulebook, whereas another Disney film would say,
The code is more what you call guidelines than actual rules.
Because Toy Santa never had any experience as a human or any understanding of how they function, it is impossible for him to comprehend why children cannot live up to the impossible standards that the rulebook, and by extension himself, have set for them.
We try to cut most of the children a little bit of slack this time of year.
I don't understand that. It looks like kids are misbehaving everywhere. They're running with scissors. They're always sticky. I'm not going to stop this car. No, we're not there yet. Brush your teeth. Pick up those clothes. It goes on and on.
But they're just kids. Everybody misbehaves sometime.
But according to the Santa handbook, naughty kids get lumps of coal in their stockings. Right? And if they don't have stockings, we will make them stockings. In my little personal opinion, I think they should all get coal in their stockings, don't you?
No, that's not how it works.
It's impossible to reason with this character because he cannot understand emotions or rationalize actions that don't fall into his shallow worldview, which is why he is turned back into a toy by the end of the film. There are only a few more good things that I think are worth mentioning. Scott and Charlie's relationship has changed in an interesting way. Charlie is more disconnected from his dad in this film because of the pressure put on him by not being able to tell people that his dad is Santa.
My friends get to go around saying, you know, my dad's a plumber, my dad's a pilot, my dad's a dentist. Well, you know what? My dad is the best thing of all, and I can't tell anyone about it. And you have no idea how hard that is, walking around that secret for all these years.
Charlie vents a lot of his frustration and anxiety about this by acting out against Newman's seeming hatred of Christmas with the acts of vandalism he commits throughout most of the film. It's a show of growth for him to come to terms with these feelings by not only making amends with her, but also by sharing the secret of Scott being Santa with Lucy at the end of the film. Meanwhile, Scott feels pressured by the red tape of the Santa Claus to get married when he's previously failed at relationships, though this is resolved relatively quickly and pretty lamely. Also, Neil and Laura have a daughter named Lucy during the time skip, probably because the creators wanted to recapture the dynamic that Scott and Charlie had in the original film. I really can't gloss over the fact that Carol decides to throw her old life away for a guy she barely knows because of the most insane logic that I've heard in a Christmas movie.
You say this is happening all so fast, but you've known me your whole life. When you were little and alone, Santa was always there for you, and I will be there for you as long as you continue to believe in me.
Nope, nope, nope. Stop talking. Go to jail.
Oh! Even though this movie's humor is nowhere near on par with the first, they rely on gross out and dumb humor a lot more. Some of the jokes still caught me by surprise.
If anybody can do this, it's you, number one.
I'm not gonna lie to all the elves. I myself think he looks absolutely terrific.
Even though the costumes and set design aren't as good as the ones in the original, they are still pretty impressive, except for the CGI, which somehow looks even more dated than the early 90s CGI from the previous film. I can only really recommend this film if you enjoyed the first enough to make a lot of concessions on its part. In other words, you'll probably get more out of it if you're drunk. And oh boy, if you thought this movie was insane, you haven't seen anything yet, baby! To begin to understand how insane this movie is, I want to make a brief comparison to Shrek's sequels. Imagine if you took the plot point of Shrek's in-laws not knowing he was an ogre and the tension between them and Fiona from Shrek 2, then combined it with Shrek longing for a simpler time in his life and being granted it in the worst way possible, like in Shrek Forever After, and then combining it with feeling half-baked and overfilled with dumb babyish humor, like Shrek the Third, and you have the unholy mess that is the Santa Claus 3, The Escape Clause. Somehow, this movie manages to be even more contrived and inane than the previous one, so if you didn't like the last film, you'd better buckle up, because you're in for a wild ride! The movie begins with Carol telling a classroom full of elves about the story of her having her first child. While she is on the edge of giving birth, Scott invites his family, as well as Carol's parents, who don't know that he's Santa and just thinks he's a Canadian toy maker, to the North Pole to keep her company. Meanwhile, Jack Frost is scheming to take Santa's place, and decides to ruin Scott's life under the pretense of doing community service, rather than having his status as a legendary figure revoked. Jack manages to throw Santa's workshop into chaos, open a rift between Scott and his family, and even freezes Neil and Laura, all while managing to figure out the process to remove Scott's status as Santa. He is able to trick him into giving up the position of Santa, causing the pair to travel back in time to when Scott originally killed Santa, allowing Frost to kill him instead and take his place. This creates a darker alternate reality that Scott manages to escape, reclaiming his title as Santa and reuniting with his family. Jack Frost is defeated and given a contrived redemption, with Scott revealing his Santa status to his in-laws and the film ending on a really sappy note. This film, without a doubt, is the weakest of the trio, because very little of it is of any actual worth. The costumes are good, but the acting is somehow worse and even more hammy than in the last one. And the plot is even more contrived.
I told you your warm hugs were magical.
2 hours later.
What's happening to me?
I'm warming your heart.
But they told me it couldn't be done.
They didn't know about magical hugs.
It even breaks continuity. Curtis has replaced Bernard as head elf, because Bernard's actor couldn't make it due to scheduling conflicts. Carol doesn't look at all like how she did in the end credits scenes of the previous film, due to the prosthetics interfering with her performance. When the plot isn't contrived, it is cliché. Scott's arc in the film is learning to set aside time for your family during the holidays, which is probably the most overused plot point you could have in a Christmas film. A lot of the plot points are repetitively explained just so the dumb kids really get it, and very few things in this movie are subtle, yet I relish the subtle background jokes in this movie, which are mainly reserved for the lengths the elves have gone to in order to disguise the North Pole. I haven't even really finished this section of the video, and I can already tell you that this movie isn't worth checking out. However, there is one element of it that I consider to have some merit, and that is Jack Frost's role in the film.
I invented Jill!
Jack Frost is insecure about being overlooked because he has no holiday associated with him, and he primarily wants Scott's job because he wants the attention that Santa receives. However, in the alternate reality where he manages to become Santa, he isn't able to find satisfaction in Santa's job, which is why he reveals the secret of Santa to the world and turns it into a theme park. Thank you, Disney, for reminding me that theme parks are, in fact, bad. Unlike Toy Santa, Jack Frost isn't really a villain. If anything, he is someone whose need for attention and lack of empathy makes him a cold and selfish person, and is mainly the face that the movie puts on its real villain: commercialization.
Welcome all you girls and boys, come on in and build a toy, Mom and Dad shall have some fun. My resort for everyone.
Commercialization is often a present threat in various Christmas movies, but in this film it has found its way into the heart of Christmas itself. Because Jack Frost was too lazy to do the duties of Santa, he has transformed the North Pole into a warped theme park, exploiting all of the various magical elements of the holiday season. The elves are enslaved as minimum wage workers, the reindeer are trapped in a petting zoo, and instead of being brought together, families are being driven apart. Without becoming Santa, Scott Calvin never went through the positive character arc he had in the first film, and this has massive ramifications for everyone he knew. Charlie never grew close to him, and instead grew distant from everyone until he became Jesse Pinkman from Breaking Bad.
And you're not going out tonight.
Oh, well, Heil Hitler, bitch!
Laura and Neil divorced after having Lucy, and Carol moved away from the area altogether. Without becoming Santa, Scott just continued working his regular job, and is now a high-ranking executive in the company that he used to work for. I mean, it makes sense to me that he plays an executive in this film. We know he's done cocaine before.
Can you keep it down? I'm trying to do drugs.
The only person who seemed to have a positive character change because of this is Neil, funnily enough. He's finally started wearing normal sweaters, and he's even grown a spine enough that he talks back to Scott.
What happened between you and Laura? Scott, I know you think therapy is like witchcraft, but you of all people might consider it. Just tell me. You don't really know because you were never around. It shouldn't be any news to you, Scott. You were never a father to Charlie. You put all the pressure on me, and guess what? He didn't want me to be his father, which messed things up pretty good between me and Laura. You want me to go on, Scott?
Stop! He's already dead!
Jack Frost isn't evil like Toy Santa. He's just misguided. It's why his contrived redemption makes some sense to me. He probably never would have done what he did if he had been given positive attention sooner, and this change comes from his heart being literally melted. But even the small bit of content that I thought wasn't handled well doesn't make this movie worth a watch. You know, at least this franchise is over now, and I don't have to talk about it anymore. It's not like, 16 years after the last film came out, for whatever reason, Disney decided to make some sort of streaming exclusive show following the events after this film. That would just be really stupid.
Christmas is in trouble. Let's go. Now we're getting somewhere.
You could not pay me to watch this. At least this year. Well, what did we learn from watching all three of these movies? Maybe milking sequels out of a movie that was good because it was a standalone story is bad, actually. On a more serious note, while I enjoyed watching all three of these movies, only the first one is worth watching if you haven't seen them already. The only way I could recommend the sequels in good faith is by recommending them as so bad they're good films. The plots and jokes may be slapshot and lazy, but the acting is so gloriously bad that you can't be bored while watching it. I found myself grinning like an idiot multiple times because I couldn't stop enjoying a film that people obviously had a lot of fun making. Even though the second movie is bad, it expands on the universe in interesting ways, and even though the plot of the third is explained repetitively in the most blatant fashion, there are some plot points that are somewhat subtly set up.
What? I said, who said I wish I'd never been Santa at all?
You're never gonna get me to say.
I wish I'd never been Santa at all.
Even though only one of these films is genuinely good, at the end of the day, what is more emblematic of the holiday season than watching movies that only really hold up because of your strong nostalgic connection to them? Merry Christmas, everyone!